In 1934, Macmillan reissued all of Hugh Walpole's published fiction, other than his separate Herries series, in a Cumberland edition with new prefaces by the author. There were some 27 titles in all. One day I'm going to have to start reading them all over again. Macmillan continued to add novels to this edition as Walpole continued to write them. He wrote about 50 books, nearly 40 of which were novels. I'm only going to talk about a few of them. The titles in his Herries Chronicle, following the fortunes of a Cumbrian family from the 18th to the 20th century, would make for a talk all on their own. In the preface to The Wooden Horse, Walpole's first novel, originally published in 1909, he writes that his discovery of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, in a mangled French translation, inspired him to write the maddest, wildest novel ever produced by an Englishman. Rather than a mad, wild novel, Walpole admitted that what he had produced was a mild novel, which may be why it was accepted by publishers Smith Elder at the first attempt. Lucky man. Before his liberation as a writer, Walpole had actually been destined for a career in the church. His father was an Anglican priest who would later become Bishop of Edinburgh. Hugh had a stint in a seaman's mission in Liverpool, which was not a success, and neither was his tenure as a schoolmaster at Epsom College. It is tempting to see a certain determinism in his eventual career, as he was descended from Horace Walpole on his father's side, and from Richard Harris Barham, author of the Inglesby Legends, on his mother's side. When his parents were in New York with his father's work, young Hugh was sent home to receive an English education. Attending a boarding grammar school, he experienced the bullying and abuse that left him suffering nightmares for the rest of his life, with a form of PTSD, convincing him of the existence of evil that he would come to explore in some of his books. In The Wooden Horse, the protagonist, Harry Trojan, see what he did there, returns home to the town of Pendragon from an exile in New Zealand for youthful misdemeanors. His father seeks a reconciliation, but Harry finds himself estranged from his upper-class family, including his now grown-up son, in opposition to those who would seek to modernise the neighbourhood and at odds with provincial morality. The Walpole scholar, Elizabeth Steele, detects links to chivalric romances in The Wooden Horse, in that Harry has to prove himself worthy of his right to primogeniture, which he does by the nature of his deeds. This includes extricating his son from a breach of promise case, basically achieved by telling the young woman concerned that she can do far better for herself than wasting her life by getting married. Despite its conventional plot, and in a device befitting the novel's title, Walpole does manage to smuggle a hint of things to come into his narrative, in the macabre origin story of the naming of the Trojan family home, the House of the Flutes. Of course, it had its origin in tradition. In the early days when might was right and the stronger seized the worldly goods of the weaker, and nobody said him nay, there had been a Sir Jeremy Trojan, whose wife had been the talk of the countryside, both because of her beauty and also because of her easy morals. Sir Jeremy having departed on a journey, the lovely Lady Clare entertained a neighbouring baron at her husband's bed and board, and for 2 days all was well. But Sir Jeremy unexpectedly returned, and being a gentleman of a pleasant fancy, walled up the room in which he had found the erring couple and left them inside. He then sat outside and listened with a gentle pleasure to their cries, and being a musician of no mean quality, played on his flute from time to time to prevent the hours from being wearisome. For 3 days he sat there, until there came no more sounds from that room. Then he pursued his ordinary affairs, but sought no other wife, a grim little man with a certain sense of humour. In an otherwise stoically realistic narrative, this rather gratuitous insert, recalling an unspecified and violent era of the past, heralds Walpole's affinity with the Gothic macabre and his incorporation of these influences into a modern context. I think the inspiration for this interlude is probably Balzac's The Mysterious Mansion, whereby a gentleman guessing that his wife has hidden her lover in a closet has the cupboard sealed up and forces her to endure the unfortunate consequent lingering death. With The Wooden Horse, Walpole embarked upon a literary career as an eventually best-selling novelist, with a side hustle of reviewing, introduction and preface writing for other people's books, and a massively lucrative turn as a touring lecturer, particularly in the USA. He became one of the most recognizable cultural figures of the 1920s and 1930s, and yet, as Michael Schmidt in his 2014 study, The Novel, a Biography, elegantly puts it, he remains a remarkable literary phenomenon, a substantial seeming planet who turns out to have been a meteor. Meteors flash across the night sky, burn up our atmosphere, and possibly leave a lump of clinker in somebody's backyard. Comets, on the other hand, can orbit the galaxy and reappear in our solar system after a passage of years to dazzle us with their display. So let's pretend Walpole is a comet. He retains a tenuous foothold or footnote in literary history. As the original for the social climbing writer Alroy Keir in Somerset Maugham's Cakes and Ale, as the author of the historical epic The Hirris Chronicle, and as a writer of occasional Gothic novels and wildly anthologized supernatural short fiction. I say Gothic-y because Walpole would not have recognized that description applied to his own work. Walpole saw the Gothic pioneers, his ancestor Horace, Mrs. Radcliffe, and Matthew Lewis, striving to create a world altogether distinct from any known one. And while Radcliffe at least attempted an internal logic with her explained supernatural, Hugh says that Horace Walpole was more laissez-faire, planting his absurd helmet just where he pleased, and you could take it or leave it. I don't think Walpole was using a euphemism there, but who knows? All the characters in these books spoke an absurd jargon, the like of which was never heard on land or sea. They were puppets, less natural than the Punch and Judy show, harking back indeed to the old mystery plays where they personified virtues and vices. They did not attempt to convince their readers of the truth of their stories, but wished to create a sort of dreamlike state in which all the horses had two heads, the villains forked tails under their pantaloons, and the heroines drank nectar and were fed on heavenly dew. Despite this apparent dismissal of the actual content of Gothic fiction, Walpole was influenced by romance writing, even beyond the solace that reading had offered him during his often troubled childhood. In an autobiographical note accompanying his contribution to the best British short stories of 1926, Walpole expressed his intention of producing novels that will follow the main tradition of the English novel, but that will be aware of the modern technique and modern psychology. It is surely more than coincident that Hugh Walpole's ambition to meld tradition with modern psychological technique echoed his ancestor, Horace Walpole's expressed desire in his preface to the second edition of The Castle of Otranto to combine old-style romance with modern 18th century realism. There's an added layer of relevance, or perhaps contrivance, when considering Hugh Walpole's memory in his autobiographical fragment, The Crystal Box, of the illegible letter which he and a school friend discovered, which they decided represented his disenfranchised claim to the estate of the Earl of Orford, the baronetcy held by his ancestor Horace. The young Hugh Walpole, already an avid reader of romances, seems to have been writing himself into both the chronology and that staple of the Gothic tradition, contested issues of primogeniture. Hugh was a devotee of Walter Scott and believed that fantastic fiction only succeeded when grounded in a foundation of believable reality. Here he is on the writer Claude Houghton, defining romance writing. Houghton is a romantic and a mystic, and his 7 novels have appeared in what is the most realistic and unmystical period of the last 150 years. When I use romantic, I mean, of course, none of the cloak and sword romance of the English novel of 40 years ago. I mean something very much more important. I mean that attitude to life which insists that there are more spiritual worlds than this one in which we live, and that it is a man's chief business to discover his relation to these worlds. I don't accept that the 20s and 30s were the romantic no-go area that Walpole describes, and he does tend to go on about this. But in his defence, he might just be reacting to the reception he received from his fellow writers. Frank Swinnerton was an opponent of Walpole's literary excursions into the uncanny, writing of a deep vein of hysteria which led to nightmare and the macabre. Walpole seems to have taken a certain amount of pleasure in repeating the admonishments he received and noting that his critics viewed his propensity for the macabre as an obstacle to critical success. He quotes Arnold Bennett as urging him to abandon his romantic falsity. Charles Morgan, writing in 1943, 2 years after Walpole's death, is uncompromising in listing a taste for the uncanny amongst those of Walpole's failings. Why did he make so many wild excursions into the macabre, knowing as he must have known in his heart that they led him to damaging excesses? Partly because in their darker aspects, they exercised over him an irresistible fascination. Partly for the flatly contrary reason that he was ingenuous about them and could give himself cold shivers with no notion that he might be failing to communicate them. To be fair to Walpole, these reactions seem to be somewhat exaggerated. And as far as posterity is concerned, it's the weird stuff that has held up. I'm not going to deep dive into Walpole's opinion on the literary landscape he found himself occupying, because it's a semantic minefield hidden in a maze. Suffice to make a few general points. Walpole suggests that realism perceives and records life with the rational faculties of observation, reason, and reminiscence, while romance observes life while inspired by the faculties of imagination. Romance is not divorced from reality, only less disciplined. Realism is no less eloquent than romance, but is hamstrung by its adherence to certitude. He says that the French novel from the end of the 19th century influenced the development of realism in England, and the Russian novel, particularly Dostoevsky, influenced modern English romance. Dostoevsky again, which brings us back to Walpole's mad, wild novel ambition, which finally saw the light of print in his second book, Macabre at 40. Macabre at 40 introduces the businessman James Macabre, who, with his wife and daughters, embarks upon their annual family holiday from Epsom to Trellis in Cornwall to stay at the Man-at-Arms Hotel. Macabre is suffering a midlife crisis, overemphasized by the 26-year-old Walpole, who later admitted that at the time he considered the age of 40 to be the end of all things. Macabre meets another guest, the young, idealistic and gushingly romantic Tony Gale, and they investigate the last night of the annual fair taking place in the town itself. According to ancient superstition, a procession was formed by all the citizens of the town, and this marched, headed by flaming torches and an ancient drum, round the walls. This had been done, so went the legend, ever since the days of the Celts, when naked invaders had marched with wild cries and derisive gestures round and round the town, concluding with a general massacre and a laying low of the walls. The town had soon sprung to life again, and the ceremony had become an anniversary, and the anniversary a fair. The last dying screams of those ancient peoples were turned now into the shrieking of a merry-go-round, and the sale of toffee, and the chattering of many old women, and there were but few in the place who remembered what those origins had been. The repressed or forgotten memory of a pagan bloodletting has been transmuted into a 3-day fun fair, culminating in a town procession. But something of the primitive origins of this event still clings to the modern ceremony. It is no coincidence that Walpole describes an itinerant preacher having to abandon his sermon in the face of the townsfolk preparing for the ritual. The march itself, with Meredith and Tony caught up in it, rapidly turns into a delirious dance of abandonment. The tune was wilder and wilder. The dance had done its work, and enough marriages were in the making to fill the church for a year of Sundays. We've all been to parties like that. In a pub, the two men meet Andreas Morelli and his beautiful daughter Janet. Walpole has described Morelli as being the devil. This devil, in description and activities, a sort of Pan-like deity, has presumably retired from general evil-doing to a quiet life in Cornwall, where he sublimates his violent urges by luring woodland creatures with the playing of the flute, whereupon he strangles them. While Meredith stumbles into an almost affair with Millie Lester, the wife of a writer staying at his hotel, an affair which basically involves him crushing her in his powerful arms, Tony and Janet inevitably fall for each other and intend to elope with Meredith's aid. In a curious plot device, Morelli initially seems keen to throw the pair together. Elizabeth Steele provides a reading of Meredith at 40 as an adaptation of some of the elements of Shakespeare's The Tempest, with Tony as Ferdinand, Janet as Miranda, and Morelli as an amalgam of Ariel and Caliban. If Morelli is actually Prospero, then his desire to unite the lovers would naturally follow. However, there is clearly something else going on. In a violent rage with his daughter Janet, Morelli destroys a tea set. Walpole later bemoaned the fact that the critics had completely missed the symbolism of this scene, the symbolic smashing of the crockery. Deconstruct that, Derrida. I do have a theory. I think that Morelli instigates Janet's relationship with Tony in order for her to lose her virginity, but he has no wish for the relationship to go any further. The destruction of the crockery representing his rejection of conventional domesticity. I'd stress that this is only my reading of the text. Walpole doesn't spell anything out. Tony is a decent young man and intends to marry Janet, and with Meredith's help, he spirits her away to the altar. Meredith, feeling some guilt in the rather underhand way they have gone about things, visits Morelli to both apologise and offer reassurance about Janet's future status. This triggers the most extraordinary scene in the book, as Morelli attempts to kill Meredith. And I've been told I need to read all of this. No, Morelli, please, my God, my God. His shoulder burnt like fire. His brain began to reel, so that he fancied that there were many people there crushing him. Then he knew that Morelli was slowly pressing him back. One hand was about his neck, but the other hand crept in through his shirt and had touched the skin. Meredith felt the fingers pressing over his chest. Then the fingers began to pinch. They caught the flesh and seemed to tear it. It was like knives. All his body was on fire. Then the fingers seemed to be all over his limbs. They crept down to his hip, his thigh. They bit into his flesh. And then he knew that Morelli was pressing some nerve in his hip and pushing it from the socket. At that moment, he himself became aware for the first time of Morelli's body. He pressed against his chest, and his fingers had torn the man's clothes away. Morelli's chest was hairy like an animal's and cold as marble. He was sweating in every pore, but Morelli was icy cold. He dug his nails into the flesh, but they seemed to slip away. His arm was right around Morelli's body. The cold flesh slipped and shrunk beneath his touch. His mouth was against Morelli's neck. He had a sudden wild impulse to bite. He was becoming a wild beast. Then Morelli seemed to encircle the whole of him. Every part of his body was touched by those horrible fingers, his arms, his neck. It was as though he were being bitten to death. Then he felt in his neck teeth. Something was biting him. He screamed again and again, but only a hoarse murmur seemed to come from his lips. He was still struggling, but he was going. The room seemed full of animals. They were biting him, tearing him, and then again he could feel the soft fingers stealing about his body. A curious feeling of sleepiness stole over him. The pain in his shoulder and his arm was so terrible that he wanted to die. His body twitched with a fresh spasm of pain. Things. he did not know what they were creeping up his legs. Soon they would be at his chest. Now, I don't know what you think is going on in that scene, but I definitely know what I think is going on in that scene. The book that eventually made the young Walpole's early name was his roman à clef, Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail, inspired by his time as a master at Epsom School. On the reissue of the book in 1955, Cyril Connolly in the Sunday Times described the book as perfectly readable, even mildly enjoyable, a semi-thriller, but quoted Walpole boasting that Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail was actually one of the early realistic novels of the realistic period. This is a book concerning Vincent Perrin, a teacher at Moffat's Academy, a Cornish public school near the small town of Pendragon, which featured in The Wooden Horse. Perrin forms a misguided infatuation for Isabelle Dessart, a friend of one of the faculty members' wives, and is driven mad by jealousy by a younger teacher, Mr. Trail, whom he sees as a rival. In the process, he suffers grand mal hallucinatory seizures in which a china figure comes to life, jumps down off the mantelpiece, runs around the room, tormenting him. His personality then splits into two, not only summoning his own doppelganger into existence, but that of his enemy Trail, whom he finally plans to murder. I have never worked in education, and it may very well be that animate anthropomorphic ceramics, Gothic doubles, and murder plots are all part and parcel of daily life in the staff room. If so, then this surely is a novel of realism, as Walpole claimed. In the latest issue of the Hugh Walpole Review, there's a fantastic reading of the text as queer Gothic, which is something I haven't sort of thought about before. I'm definitely going to be interested in reading that, possibly with a jealous academic sneer. On the theme of doppelgangers and doubling, the book also exists in two versions. Walpole's American publishers called for a rewrite for continental publication, disliking the morbidity and perhaps the melodrama of the ending. In the original, Perrin launches an assaulting Trail, pitches a younger man over a cliff, only then to come to his senses and save his rival from the rising tide before he sacrifices himself. The two versions part company during the speech day and prize-giving ceremony towards the end of the book. Walpole ditches the murder plot denouement for American publication, and in the other book, The Gods and Mr. Perrin, replaced it with Perrin interrupting speech day with a tirade against the school and the headmaster. Perrin's outburst has no effect whatsoever, but Isabel reassures him that things will now be different, and the book ends with Perrin looking forward to a new term. So good luck with that, Mr. Perrin. Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail came to the screen in 1948, after Walpole's death, when his reputation could still be used in advertisements. From the famous book by Hugh Walpole, acclaimed by millions. The subtitle to Walpole's second book, Maradic at 40, was A Transition, signalling both his credo regarding the balancing of tradition and modern techniques, and his own development into the sort of writer he wished to become after his conventional debut. In the preface to the Cumberland edition, Walpole identifies Maradic at 40 as his first attempt at genre, and includes three other books: The Prelude to Adventure from 1912, Portrait of a Man with Red Hair from 1925, and Above the Dark Circus from 1931, as further attempts in a field exemplified for him by Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables. These four novels, Maradic, Prelude, Red Hair, and Dark Circus, would later be collected as Four Fantastic Tales. And here's that book with its imaginative, if undescriptive, cover by the painter Rex Whistler. If you want a cover that really does its job, here's Jerzy Duda-Graz's illustration. Eventually, there we are. Of Hugh Walpole's novel, Portrait of a Man with Red Hair. This is from the cover of the Hugh Walpole Review, the twice-yearly journal of the Hugh Walpole Society. The Society has also published a couple of collections of Walpole's uncollected short story. There's Red Amber from 23, and Gifts My Friends, which is supposed to come out next month. Portrait of a Man with Red Hair was initially commissioned by Arthur Vance for serialization with the Pictorial Review when Walpole was in New York after a lecture tour in 1923. Walpole completed the book in under 2 months, which reflects his view of it as a simple shocker, but also anticipates the creative freedom he would bring to his equally rapidly written shocker, The Killer and the Slain. In the event, Vance got cold feet at the content and passed on publication, but Walpole's American publisher, George Doran, managed to place the serialization with Cosmopolitan for a lower fee. Portrait of a Man with Red Hair is a modern tale of chivalry, with a psychological twist in the depiction of its mentally tortured villain, Crispin, the red-haired man of the title. The book is a pared-down rewrite of Maradic at 40, with no attempt at parallel storylines. The plot briskly follows a structure which might be summarized as problem, rescue, reversal, peril, and salvation. The hero, Charles Percy Harkness, an expatriate American, comes to the service of a damsel in distress, falls in love with her, but sets aside his own feelings to rescue her from a loveless marriage and reunite her with her lover, finding his own moral and physical courage in the process. As the story opens, Harkness is journeying by train to Trellis, urged to visit there after a chance meeting with James Maradic. Recognizing something in Harkness, Maradic offers him access to what we pretentious English literature types term a limit experience. Do you want adventure, romance, something that will pull you right out of yourself and test you, show you whether you are real or no, give you a crisis that will change you forever? Do you want it? Elizabeth Steele recounts the reaction of one reader of the book, who noted that having encountered a maniac during his holiday at Trellis, Maradic pushes his new friend to go there too, whereupon the same thing happens, albeit with a different maniac. Harkness has a lack of courage derived from his commitments issues, a romantic young man with romantic ideas who will be called upon to do good deeds, but whose romantic notions form a barrier to intimacy and a shying away from the reality of personal relationships and the more unpleasant aspects of real life. To develop as a person, Harkness will be required to shed his armour, make a connection with the people around him, a process which begins with his shedding of inhibitions by taking part in the Trellis dance, that particular rite resurfacing from Maradic at 40. Harkness aims to rescue a young woman, Hester, from the clutches of her husband Herrick and Crispin, her abusive father-in-law. Crispin is a sadist, torturing his daughter-in-law as part of a perverse experiment. Following abuse by his own father, Crispin has come to believe in a cruel God who derives his power from inflicting punishment. The route to sharing power is through mastering pain and then inflicting it upon others, so that they may learn to master it in turn, thus creating a consensus of enlightenment through suffering. Crispin's memories of his surgeon's father's experiment in torture anticipate Leo Marx's script for Michael Powell's film Peeping Tom, in which disturbed killer Mark Lewis was used as a guinea pig for his psychologist father's investigations into the basis of fear. Harkness and Dunbar, Hester's childhood sweetheart, rescue the threatened girl, but the fugitives become lost in a sea fog and inevitably find themselves back at Crispin's tower home, where they are recaptured and subdued by his Japanese manservants using martial arts. The imprisoned Harkness has a heavily symbolic and revelatory dream, a Dante-esque vision of purgatory where he is forced to confront some of his sins. The sins themselves, gossip, spitefulness, and petty theft, seem comparatively mild to be causing him so much anguish and guilt. Harkness has a great fear of physical pain, but once the reality of physical torture becomes imminent, he experiences a sense of liberation. In a Grand Guignol finale, Harkness, Dunbar, and a local fisherman, Jabez, who has helped them, are stripped naked, bound to pillars on the uppermost floor of Crispin's tower, and a knife-wielding Crispin then proceeds to torture them while appropriately dressed in white silk pajamas. Jabez, his eyes gouged out by Crispin, suddenly snaps his bonds, seizes his tormentor, and hurls him from the tower to his death, in what Elizabeth Steele has observed is a somewhat unconvincing invocation of the Deus ex machina. Ironically, Harkness, constrained and limited by a plethora of hang-ups at the start of the book, is at last liberated by his experiences in a near vindication of Crispin's philosophy. The crucial difference being that Harkness falls in love with Hester, but gives her up to Dunbar, the revelation of his own moral courage, providing the physical courage to withstand the knife. Walpole is dismissive of the book in his preface to the Cumberland edition, claiming he only discovered that he was supposed to have written a treatise on sadism once the book had appeared. He suggests that the book should be read as it was written, as the lightest and simplest of adventures. Dunbar, at one point, declares to Harkness that their adventure wouldn't make a bad shocker, only you'd never be able to make Crispin convincing. Dunbar's throwaway observation on the authenticity of the book that he is actually a character in, hinging on the credibility of its villain, seems to be a metafictional joke. And speaking personally, I've never met a fiction I didn't like. The book was adapted for the stage by Ben Levy and enjoyed a short but successful run in London with Charles Laughton as Crispin and James Whale as Herrick, his son. Whale, of course, would go on to direct Frankenstein for Universal Pictures, reunite with Laughton for The Old Dark House, and make The Bride of Frankenstein with Laughton's wife, Elsa Lanchester, playing both Mary Shelley in an opening scene featuring Byron and Percy Shelley, as well as playing the creature's mate. The play of Portrait of a Man with Red Hair transferred to the United States, where another giant in the form of Edward G. Robinson played the title role. In the preface to Four Fantastic Tales, Walpole claimed that Portrait of a Man with Red Hair was in the process of being turned into a film in Hollywood. I've searched what resources there are, but I can't find any evidence to support this claim, though the story did eventually appear on British television as an episode in ITV's Hour of Mystery in 1957. Laughton and Walpole were reunited, albeit briefly, in the early days of production on Walpole's adaptation for MGM of David Copperfield, prior to Laughton's replacement in the role of Macabre by the equally great W.C. Fields. All that ultimately distinguishes Walpole's genre and non-genre novels is the degree to which they embrace sensation and the fantastic. Walpole usually manages to smuggle something sensational into the most pedestrian of narratives. His Jeremy stories, books about children, not for children, are a case in point. In Walpole's first book about the child, Jeremy, the defiant 8-year-old, discovers that the fear his new governess has of losing her job gives him a power over her, something Walpole describes in an entirely unexpected way. It was something almost abstract in its manifestations. It was something indecent, sinister, secret, foreign to his whole nature, felt by him now for the first time. Unanalysed, of course, but belonging, had he known it, to that world of which afterwards he was often to catch glimpses. That world of shining white faces in streets, of muffled cries from shuttered windows, of muttered exclamations, half caught, half understood. He was never again to be quite free from the neighbourhood of that half-world. He would never be quite sure of his dominance of it until he died. And that's an 8-year-old kid. In a later story, the young Jeremy falls under the spell of a tattooed sea captain who both attracts and repels him. The captain promises to come visit Jeremy some night because he's taken a fancy to him. And Jeremy should keep his eyes open and his tongue quiet if he does. The knowledge that nothing bad is going to happen, the captain burgles the house in the end, doesn't dilate doesn't dilute the tension that Walpole brings to the story and the terror that the child experiences. And yet here's the blurb from the front flap of the collected edition of Jeremy Stories. 3 of Hugh Walpole's most delightful works. They all carry the reader back to a golden, glamorous age of endless hot summers and genuine crisp winters, full of merrymaking, of snugness, confidence, security, unmenaced peace. No, no, there is terror lurking in the nursery. Walpole saw short story writing as a distraction from the business of writing novels, but it was lucrative and he did it. A lot of them, like the novels, are overlong, could do with editing, and some of them miss the point. Many of them are so sentimental that they should carry a warning for diabetics. His supernatural short fiction, his spooks, on the other hand, are often little gems of the form and reinforce the belief that the weird tale was his forte. The fact that so many have been anthologized bear this out. In the story Mrs. Lunt, Walpole does a rather admirable thing that I think displays his command of the ghost story. He uses a double narration in which the initial narrator extracts a story about the ghost of a vengeful spouse from a house guest, the second narrator. The first narrator is already recalling the incident, and the story was subsequently told at a later point of time. He explains that he can't vouch for the truth of the story he was told, given that these ghost stories are nearly always at second or third hand. But having got the story at source, as he puts it, he goes on to attest to the honesty of the second narrator, who himself has queried the accuracy of his own memory of events. This distancing technique allows for a note of skepticism, neither confirming nor denying the truth of the incidents related, while actually serving to reinforce a likelihood of the tale being believed. Why Mrs. Lunt hated her husband, haunted him, and, we are led to believe, throttled him from beyond the grave, is of less concern than the way in which Walpole tells it. Mrs. Lunt appeared in Walpole's collection All Souls' Night, and has been widely anthologized since, as has another story concerning ghostly retribution from that collection, The Snow. Valancourt Books reissued All Souls' Night, along with the novel The Killer and the Slain, which I will come to later. Vengeance is the theme of The Tarn, another favourite of the anthologies. It appeared in Walpole's earlier collection, The Silver Thorn, concerning the murder of the drowning of one author by another who feels his own career has been overshadowed. If the story had appeared a couple of years later, it might have been seized upon as Walpole sublimating his desire to enact revenge upon Somerset Maugham for satirising him. Back to All Souls' Night. Tarnhelm is a real oddity. It concerns a young boy who is sent to live with his 2 uncles, Robert and Constance, in Cumberland. Robert reveals he possesses the artifact of the title, the magic headgear from Wagner's Ring Cycle, as used by Alberic and Siegfried to transform themselves. In the course of the story, Robert transforms into an evil-looking yellow dog, which terrorizes the boy. The story works in that the nature of the threat posed by his uncle and the dog is never spelled out. I'm an ex-postman, so maybe I'm more susceptible, but the story transmits a distressing atmosphere that it is hard to pin down. The Silver Mask, another story from All Souls' Night, is perhaps Walpole's tour de force of short fiction. In The King's Road, on her way back from a party, a middle-aged lady, Miss Sonia Herries, is accosted by a starving stranger, the handsome young man of all romantic stories. Tall, dark, pale, slim, distinguished. Against her better judgment, but desperately lonely and clearly attracted by his good looks, she invites him in and gives him food and drink. He then admires the beauty of her possessions, particularly a silver clown mask wall hanging, and shows himself to be a cultured and knowledgeable about art, despite claiming to be a pimp, a thief, or what you like. The young man, Henry Abbott, continues to call, engages himself as Sonia's secretary, and over time moves his wife and child and an assortment of relatives into her home, despite Sonia's resistance. The maid gives notice, and becoming terrified at a predicament, Sonia suffers a recurrence of a heart problem and eventually finds herself confined to an attic, while Henry entertains his family and friends at Sonia's expense and sells off her art collection. Henry visits her room and hangs the silver mask on the bedroom wall so that she will have something to look at, as he tells her she is too ill to ever leave the attic again. The short story was developed into a play, Kind Lady, in New York by Edward Chodorow, and filmed twice, in 1935 with Eileen McMahon and Basil Rathbone, and in 1951 with Ethel Barrymore and Maurice Evans. I have a bizarre movie poster for the second film, which includes a massive printed plot spoiler presented as a sort of spoof newspaper stop press. You can read that at the bottom of the poster. Walpole draws Sonia Herries as a woman of 50 with many friends and socially active, but secretly desperately lonely and with thwarted maternal instincts. A reckless action in casually befriending a much younger man on the basis of physical attraction and taking him into her home with the resulting sinister consequences does seem to have wider implications. Approaching the story with an awareness of Walpole's sexuality, another reading becomes apparent. Walpole would have been familiar with the danger of intimacy with strangers, not only that posed by falling foul of the criminal law of the time, but the ever-present risk of violence or blackmail. Walpole's last completed novel, The Killer and the Slain, was posthumously published in 1942 after his untimely death the previous year. To my mind, it is his most effective genre novel, in that he finally succeeds in marrying traditional narrative with a modern psychological approach. The Killer and the Slain takes the form of a written account by John Ozias Talbot, a sensitive romantic soul of unassuming and prudish habits, devoted to his mother, somewhat repulsed by his father, and in the terms of the book's central conceit, in possession of a feminine nature. Talbot runs an antique business with his wife Eve in Seabourn in Glebeshire, but his real enthusiasm is as a novelist. Talbot was tormented at school by James Oliphant Tunstall, who teased him mercilessly while professing affection for him and claiming they were the closest of friends. Talbot and Tunstall lose touch while the latter forges a successful career in London as a portrait artist. But to Talbot's dismay, Tunstall returns to settle in Seabourn with his wife Leela when his career stalls. Tunstall is everything Talbot hates, a hirsute, fleshy, masculine man, fond of drink and women, who enjoys an easy familiarity with his fellows. Once embedded back in the Seabourn community, Tunstall resumes his teasing domination of Talbot, inflicting upon him the physical contact that Talbot hates, declaring him to be his oldest friend and insisting on the existence of a deeper bond. I'm the other side of yourself, Jacko, the side you're not very proud of. Tunstall embarks upon an affair with Bella, a local woman, and insists upon sharing every intimate detail with his prudish victim. Eventually, driven to distraction, jealous of Tunstall's flirtatious intimacy with Eve, his wife, and the way their young son responds to the other man, Talbot hatches a plan to kill his enemy, which he does, pushing him off a cliff one night as Tunstall is on his way to an assignation with Bella. Talbot's killing of Tunstall has an immediate impact. He goes home to Eve and asserts himself in the bedroom, and begins to behave with more confidence in general. But Talbot feels himself haunted by Tunstall's presence, and finds himself in possession of facts which only the murdered man could have known. Talbot begins a process of transformation, physically putting on weight and becoming more hirsute, while adopting the other man's bluff, self-confident personality. Meanwhile, the sense of being haunted increases, and Talbot fears he's being possessed, something which Walpole expresses in sexualized terms. I was little John Talbot, just as I used to be, but John Talbot who had been ravished, assaulted, invaded, possessed. Something, someone had been within me that night. Yes, had dwelt within me and been master of me. The initial stage of transformation may be designated as Talbot Tunstall, with Talbot ascendant, but aware of an external mocking presence and fearful of penetration and possession by the other's personality. The second stage of transformation follows that possession as Tunstall Talbot, with the dead man's personality in control, expressing contempt for Talbot's previous life, regretting the act of homicide, and becoming increasingly paranoid and violent in reaction to society's disapproval. Talbot's personality, meanwhile, has become subsumed, a buried memory, now only occasionally manifested as a disembodied weeping. An obvious inspiration for the book is Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a work Tunstall references when claiming to be Talbot's darker side, although he points out that Stevenson's book was just a story, while they form a real alliance, like Siamese twins. While Talbot appears to suffer a quite literal transformation into Tunstall, there remains a suggestion that he is fulfilling darker impulses of his own, the act of murder unleashing bottled up resentment for years of bullying and humiliation. Homoerotic themes present in The Killer and the Slain are also present in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and a more obvious reference to the earlier work occurs when the psychotically violent Tunstall Talbot kills an innocent bystander in a frenzied attack recalling Hyde's assault on Sir Danvers Carew. The Killer and the Slain was written against the background of war and the threat of invasion, when Walpole genuinely feared the possibility of incarceration in a concentration camp by an occupying Nazi force, as he revealed in a propaganda pamphlet, Open Letter of an Optimist, from 1941. The merged character of Tunstall Talbot becomes increasingly vocal in support of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and he is spurned by the seaborne community for his fascistic views, which in turn fuels his paranoia and sociopathy. Tunstall Talbot then travels to London in murderous pursuit of the widowed Leela's gentle brother Richard, whom he has come to identify with his previous self, in order to purge any vestiges of the other man from his psyche. With Tunstall Talbot in London is Tunstall's former lackey, Cheeseman, whom he subjects to casual torture, forcing him to kneel in front of him in a state of almost sexual subjugation and making him share his hotel bed. Prior to his murder by Talbot, Tunstall was a sensualist whose only interests were drink, women, and making money. Sir Tunstall Talbot's conversion to the fascist cause indicates a further layer of possession beyond that of Talbot by the spirit of his tormentor. Leela Tunstall believes her late husband was already wrestling with such a possession before his death, and describes the Nazi hierarchy as mere vessels for a much greater evil. Towards the end of the book, Tunstall Talbot declares, "He is obeying the will of my master, who tells me what I must do," the inference being that he is possessed by the devil. In the midst of a world war, Walpole depicts the Nazis as agents of diabolic evil. Just as Talbot becomes his opposite, Walpole turns his creative formula on its head. In his usual work, his central protagonists are often artistic souls, whose best friends are decent, supportive, powerfully built, and down-to-earth chaps, perhaps bordering on the naive. The central male friendship in this novel is one-sided and perverse, based on domination rather than mutual support. Tunstall, as representative of Walpole's powerfully built ideal male, is gone to seed and bordering on the corpulent. Relationships between men and women in Walpole's novels are either troubled or romanticised, with ideal women pursued only to be given up, as in Portrait of a Man with Red Hair. In The Killer and the Slain, Eve is Talbot's perfect woman made flesh, with an expression of one of Burne-Jones's angels. However, there is a suggestion that Eve was not a virgin on her and Talbot's wedding night, and she is explicit in revealing that men like Tunstall are the kind of man she is really attracted to. Another example of Walpole's subverting his own formula concerns the moment of epiphany, whereby his protagonists are transformed for the better by a crisis. In The Killer and the Slain, this come when Talbot murders Tunstall, but is then transformed into what he previously despised. The most pertinent comment upon The Killer and the Slain comes within the book itself, when Tunstall, having seen some of the youthful Talbot's literary efforts, advises him to spice them up. Later on, when you're selling things to the papers, put in bits about girls' legs and that sort of thing. That's what sells. After all, it's what men are always thinking of, a bit of skirt. The book is Walpole taking Tunstall's advice, spicing up his efforts, fully embracing the popular genre novel with its ingredients of sex and violence, and providing an effective psychological fantasy in the process. Now, if you're interested in Hugh Walpole, you haven't come across him before, the first point of call is obviously the texts, but there are a couple of contemporary accounts, Tradition on Hugh Walpole from 1930 by Clemens Dane, and Hugh Walpole: A Study, 1933 by Margaret Steen, rather hagiographic treatments. I think of Dane and Steen as Walpole's cheerleaders. I'm going to do the routine now. Hugh Walpole, he's our man. If he can't write it, no one can. Whoops. There's some other books about Hugh Walpole. Walpole was the subject of a Master of Arts thesis by Jessie Marion Porter of Boston University that considered the importance of his personal experience in his work. That top book there is Rupert Hart Davis's authorized biography, drawing heavily on Walpole's journals and correspondence to integrate the life and the work. And the other two books, both by Elizabeth Steele, the only really comprehensive study of his literary output, Elizabeth Steele's Hugh Walpole. You've heard me quote from Elizabeth all through this talk. She followed that up with Sir Hugh Walpole in the United States, a novelist's view of 1919-1936 America. That covers his lecture tours and his brief career in Hollywood. She did a fantastic amount of research for that book. It's amazing. Here are the books which I think are the strongest macabre and sensational shockers. Married at 40, Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail were mentioned. The Prelude to Adventure was admired by Carl Gustav Jung. There's a murder in it right at the beginning, and Jung said society would be a better place if there were more murders done by good people. The Old Ladies was made into a play, Portrait of a Man with Red Hair with Covered. Farthing Hall is a sort of modern Gothic parody. Captain Nicholas is like a crime story. The Inquisitor is about a whole town being haunted after a murder. The Sea Tower is about a mother-in-law's jealousy of her daughter-in-law, which ends with an attempted murder. All happy family stuff. The Harry's Chronicle is virtually all Gothic. The Dark Forest is his Russian novel. Tarnhelm is a wonderful collection from Tartarus Press of his supernatural fiction. All Souls Night we've mentioned. And there's the two new books coming out from that, Hugh Walpole Society. The Old Ladies is the only real ghost or horror story in Red Amber. And there's an excellent ghost story, one excellent ghost story in Gifts My Friends, The Slippers, which I'm amazed has never appeared in an anthology before. It's very, very good. And that's all we've got time for, probably. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.